Thank you everyone for coming on. I guess we're gonna have a Q&A afterwards, so be sure to think up a lot of questions because I just don't want to be talking for 45 minutes. Yeah, so the story that I wrote was about a police department in the south suburbs of Illinois, small village called Robbins that we'll get into. And we found that it was just like a dumping ground for officers that get fired. Um, and this is my name, where I work at the Illinois Answers Project, my Twitter handle, my email address. And I uploaded my GitHub today, which I hadn't done actually for the story. So all of the data that I use in the story, the R analysis, the data that I created in the story, it's all up there. So feel free to look around. That's why I put it up there. If you have any questions, you can always email me or reach out to me. But here we go. So the story that I wrote began with a tip, as a lot of our good stories do. And we basically got an email saying that there's an officer who is working in the Robbins Police Department who moved there after he was fired from another police department for having sex with a woman inside of his squad car. And this is a woman who he met while she was in high school at Homewood Flossmoor High School, and he was the community resource officer. And once she graduated and she turned 18, that's when their relationship began. And now he's working, he has a second career in law enforcement. And this is the kind of thing that typically would end your career doing this, but for him, it just kind of delayed his career for a couple years. So like anything, we get the tip, I followed up with it, I asked about it, and then I began checking to see what I could find out about it. And, the first step was confirming who the guy was. And so very briefly, this is this was some of the information that I got basically was this appellate ruling. As you can see right here, Larry Hall was fired from his job as a police officer in Flossmoor after having sex in a patrol car while on duty and then lying to superiors about it. He claims it is discrimination. And so that right here, you could see the name, Larry V. Hall, Jr., plaintiff, Flossmoor. You can see the kind of facts of it. But for us, that's just the first step because there could be many Larry Halls, and there are in law enforcement in Illinois. So to do that, we use this database called the Form E database, and it's kept by the Illinois State Police Training and Standards Board. It's something I learned about several years ago while I was writing about some other issue involving police. But it's great because it keeps the police officer's name, the police officer's birth year, the name, the birth year, the gender, where they worked, like the dates of employment, and the reason why they left. It's updated regularly, and you can get it by, putting out a FOIA and asking for it, and they'll turn it over for you. And this information, this Form E database is in my GitHub. You can see it. It's a bit old now at this point, but if you're interested in looking at what it contains, you can just kind of find it there. And so this is a great database. It has, 230,000 rows in it, but really gives you information on everyone who's worked in law enforcement in Illinois. And if you're writing about criminal justice, it is one of the most important things I think that you can have data-wise. And I made a little screenshot of of what it looks like, and this is in the PSQL, like the terminal that I use, and I use the terminal primarily just to for fast reference. But if I'm doing analysis, I do it in R. But I use this for kind of easy reference, and I also use it when I'm showing people how I work because to them it looks like I'm in the Matrix, right, with the black and the green. But anyways, so you can see here some information that is contained in this database. The PTBID, this is really important because it's like an individual identifier for every officer. So if John W. Smith is one person and he worked at 8 different places, you can identify who that person is by that number, right? So it can help you differentiate who the people are. The first, the middle, the last, the suffix, birth year, employer, active, whether working or not, appointed, separation, separation, and branch type. And you can see here separation includes like that's if people know why they left, but termination is one of those. And for our officer here, Larry Hall, as you can see, we use this. There's several Larry Halls, but we use this to identify who exactly he is. And how do we know that's him? Because it says Robbins Police Department, terminated for cause 2009. Same PID number for the Robbins Police Department, began work in 2014, and he works there today. So it lines up. So this means that, I know who this person is. And in the same database, I use that. I did like a quick analysis in SQL to identify the work histories of every officer who's worked in Robbins Police Department. And this helped me just kind of beef up the story. I could find more officers that got fired somewhere else and came there. But this just gave me a spot to kind of move from. Like once I knew there's this one guy, you got to figure there's more, right? And so I had this database and I used it to identify officers who are also terminated. Like this guy right here, Antonio Maddox. So I have in the screenshot who's highlighted. There's separation here. It says charged. That means criminally charged, and that's the reason he was fired. And in our story, we kind of get into him about he had domestics in his background already before he was hired there, and then he was brought on, he was trained, and then during another domestic situation, he fired a gun that went through his windshield in his garage, and I think we did something else bad. But that's the reason he got fired, and he shows up in here. And that's something that we noted in our story, and I found out about it because it was in the database. And so just a minute, I want to talk about the village of Robbins. It's a suburb that is in the south suburbs. It's kind of between Blue Island and Midlothian, Posen, and it's just this little section, and it's a pretty remarkable city. It's an interesting place, and there's more to it than just some of the goons that I've written about before. It's they say like that it's like one of the first incorporated Black municipality that's north of the Mason-Dixon line. It was the first Black-owned municipal airport. It's no longer there. It's home of Mr. T, Dwayne Wade, Kiki Palmer, Michelle Nichols, who was kind of a groundbreaking figure on the show Star Trek. There's a Robbins History Museum in town where you can learn about what the village has done in the past. It's actually built on a limestone, like a huge, just massive limestone. And they talk about that. They actually have limestone in the museum. You can see photos from when the Garvey, the civil rights leader, when he rode through town. On top of it, it's also one of the poorest communities in Illinois. Very high poverty rate. I think it's like 34% or something like that. There's nothing really like it in Cook County, with the exception of maybe Fort Heights. This is kind of where we go from there. And it's a place that I've written about for years. Before I was at the Better Government Association / Illinois Answers Project, I worked for the Daily Southtown in the south suburbs, which is just a great place to work as a young person, because you can really get the extremes that occur in Chicago out there, where there's a lot of wealth in like Orland Park, for example, or Homer Glen, and then you go to Robbins and in some of the poorest people in the state, and you just see a lot. You see a lot of like racial dynamics, class dynamics. It's kind of all on display there. And so I've written about Robbins a lot. When I was here, I wrote a story about there being literally no accountability for police shootings in the suburbs. And I opened the story actually with a 13-year-old who was shot in the back when he was standing on the front doorway of his aunt's house. And it was an officer who was making like $10 an hour or something like that. So it's been on my radar. It's just a place where there's not a lot of resources, and where police officers just don't get paid. And so the police department there has just had a lot of problems. And here's some headlines that I'd written in the past. There was a police chief who was fired because there's a police captain who, when he applied, was using a picture of the badge that Joe Friday used in the show Dragnet, right? Kind of farcical. There's another guy who was in the department, who hired his wife despite the fact that she, failed out of the academy. Another officer went on a Judge TV show and squabbled with another cop about a diamond engagement ring. And then, when you think about like some of the things I'm saying are like just kind of ludicrous, but with any police department, they have a lot of power, and crimes happen, and somebody needs to address them. And so what happened in Robbins in 2013 was that the sheriff took over briefly because they didn't have any manpower, and the sheriff discovered 51 sexual assault kits that had just been collecting dust in a room. And ultimately, the total number of sexual assaults that they had files on was hundreds that just were not investigated properly. So the stakes are really high in a situation like this, and I think it's important to keep that in mind, especially when I mentioned some of these other hijinks. So I didn't want to make it about one guy or a bad police department. The question is, you know, how do I show people how things work more broadly, right? Because it's just not about this one bad guy who worked there. As I showed you, there's multiple examples of what's happening. So I went back to the For Me database, which I showed earlier, and this is the query I wrote into this, and I should have added notes when I wrote it because I kind of forgot how it works. I know basically how it works, but basically what I did was I identified every police officer who was fired in the state of Illinois, and then I used one of the SQL functions, like partition and some other things, to show the next place that they were hired at as a police officer after the date that they were fired, right? So if somebody worked one police job for 20 years as just like a part-time job, but he got fired from one job, that first job he worked at would not show up under my query. It's if you get employed after you got fired for cause. And that is what that's what it showed. And what I did then is I removed duplicates. So if the same guy got fired from the same police department and got rehired multiple times, I took that out of the equation. And then what I did was I did counts for that same period from 2000 on. I did counts about how many people they actually employed in that time. Again, removing duplicates. And then what I did was I divided that by, or I divided the number of cops who had been the cops who were fired and then went somewhere else by the number of cops that were overall employed by that place where they went to, right? So you could see what percentage of cops were working at a place right after they got fired from somewhere else. And that's what I did, and the data gets, unreliable the further you go. But if you look here, there's Larry Hall. You can see here that this is what the data that showed that I did. It shows that he was at the Flossmoor Police Department. He was terminated for cause in 04 or in 09. And then he was appointed in the Robbins Police Department in March of 2014. And then you could see here, you could see all the departments. And you could see that in Robbins, Illinois, 17% of all their officers since 2000 went there after being fired from somewhere else. And what I didn't do for the story, just because I think it would have kind of diluted the point I was making, was look at the amount of officers that had been fired from other departments that worked there. Not that went there first, but just worked there more generally. And I mean, it has to be like north of like 40%. But I did this just because it shows that this is like a landing spot for people right after they get fired. And if you look at this list right here, Robbins, Lorton, which is downstate. So this is not just a suburban or Chicago issue. This is a downstate issue. Same with Cairo, Dixmoor, Mounds. These are all departments that are very poor. These are departments that don't have very much money to pay officers. And that's the kind of common denominator here. And so, what happens when you pay people $10 an hour to patrol an area that has a lot of guns and gangs and drugs? It's just rife for bad things happening. Chicago, for example, like after like a certain period of time, after 6 months or 12 months or something, the pay starts at $80,000 for a full-time job. So that just kind of shows what's happening. And because of that, Chicago isn't really like even close to on the list of officers going there after being fired from somewhere else, because their standards are actually higher. It's a bigger bureaucracy. They have more resources to deal with things and more resources to offer people. And I think people might be surprised by that, but it's the truth. And so then it's just, a matter of shoe leather reporting to get it down. So you can see right here in the picture, that's the mayor of Robbins, Darren Bryant. And, he was pretty honest about it. He said that basically sometimes we take what we can get when it comes to, the difficult task of hiring part-time, low-paid police officers. The quote here, just because you got fired doesn't mean you can't grow or can't learn from your last job. It's almost a restorative practice, and that's basically his words, talking about the Robbins Police Department, where he's the mayor. And so that kind of gets to the heart of it, right? People go there because they got fired from somewhere else, and they go there and they can keep their badge, and they can keep their gun, and they can use it to pursue other things. And so here's just a few of the people that we kind of sought out, or we identified by looking at this list of officers who were fired who went there. There were 3 officers on the Brady list, which means they're either prohibited from going and testifying in court, or they go to court. They have to know basically that they did something that could mean that their testimony is unreliable. And there are 2 officers that went to Robbins, again, all Black community. Or mostly majority Black community, who were involved in the cover-up of Laquan McDonald's murder before being hired by the Robbins Police Department. Like, they were, found guilty of helping cover up the murder, lying about it, so on and so forth. And then they were hired by the Robbins Police Department. One of them was fired shortly thereafter because he couldn't get his papers cleared. Another one did get hired, and then she went to the Bridgeview Police Department, where she works today. She lied about the relationship she had with the officer that was found guilty of it. And I think she also said basically that she didn't see it happen because she was trying to park the car, but the shooting happened over a number of seconds, certainly longer than it would be to park a car. Well, anyways, and then there's another officer who used a forged signature belonging to his former police chief in a failed effort to request a vacation day. And this officer, the chief, who saw his own signature forged, obviously was not happy with us. But they hired him, and then after we wrote the story, or we kind of brought it to their attention, they fired him. And also, as we note here, there's one former Robbins police officer who came to the department in 2016 after the UIC Police Department fired from this off-duty fight in the Little Italy neighborhood, where he removed his duty weapon from the waistband of his pants, handed to another officer, his then girlfriend. So basically, like, the person who he was about to fight, he made sure that this person saw his gun. He was put in in the back of a squad car at one point, and then another officer came and bailed him out. So he was fired for that. And one of the things that was interesting about him is that in his deposition to this wrongful termination lawsuit, which he lost, he said he was paid twice as much in private security as he made in Robbins, where he made $10.25 an hour. So it shows you, this is a person where, like, he has his badge, but being able to use the badge in a private security job, can make you more money. It's not crazy money, but he said that if he's working like a federal contract, it's even higher. So there are opportunities and there are reasons someone would want to hold up their badge even after they got it taken away. And for him, I think he now works in the last I talked to him, he worked in the defender's office, doing like investigations for the defender's office. And then, so part of this is, we have to, whenever we write a story, we have to talk to the people that we write about. In this case, it was Larry Hall. He's the one that the whole story kind of was about. And he wouldn't say much, deferred to the village spokesperson. And, I told him in plain words again and again and again, what I was writing about, and I gave him the chance to talk. And he just wasn't, and just, deferred to the spokesperson. And the spokesperson used a statement that like a small statement that we kind of clipped at the end of our story. It's the kicker of our story. And we sent these really detailed questions, and we said, we need these within like a week or something, firm deadline, a week, because I was going on vacation and I wouldn't have access to my email. And like, by the time I saw that they responded to it, I just got back from vacation that day, and the story published was too late. So if anyone here is working in public relations, I recommend that if someone gives you a deadline about questions, and you want that to be reflected in the story, you send it within the deadline, or else, that's going to happen. I also spoke to, the woman in this situation, who he had this, relationship with her. And when I looked through the documents, it was really, kind of sad, just like kind of what happened. Like, her family told investigators that, she transferred to the school as adjusting well, because with therapy, because she was living with her mother in Chicago, and her mother was dating a Chicago police officer who would physically abuse them. And so you could kind of see, some parallels here. And she met him, he said hello to her after she turned 18 at the school. And after she graduated, he gave her a number. Her parents said that he was very controlling and he was verbally abusive. And that when he gets angry, when she goes out to parties, in an interview with investigators, she said that she gave him up to $4,000. This is an 18-year-old, gave this police officer $4,000 to this day, which, she has not repaid. But what was interesting in talking to her and reaching out to her and trying to reflect her voice in the story is that, she said that, he did take advantage of a young woman, but people should be given a second chance. And so, people are always, they always surprise me when I talk to them. I'm never not surprised when I talk to people. And I think that's a good part of trying to get someone's side of the story, because, it's their experience and it's their life, and they just have different ideas, about something like this. And the fact that, she had forgiveness in her heart wasn't something that I, thought too much about. But in talking to her, I could at least talk to her. I could tell her what I was working on and why. And, she was kind of caught off guard by it, but she understood. And I told her I was going to use her name, because, you know, for her own safety, pretty much, and for her own privacy, because she didn't really, bring, being on the media on herself, let alone with this guy. And so then eventually we, did a story with WGN Investigates. There's like a video story. I'm not going to show it here. It's about 5 minutes. But Lourdes and I went out and we talked to some of the Robbins police officers, and we got footage of, the mayor deferring to his spokesperson, and got some, comments from Tom Dart and other people. And it was a good package. And the database that we used got a lot of attention. And I was hoping I could share this just real quick. So I just want to, if I can, my computer is kind of slow, but I can just show people real quick just how it how the database works. So this is their story, and then you look here, and it might take a minute, but like so right here, like if you look up Hall, for example, and Hall's the guy that we wrote about. These are all the Halls. And you can see that Larry Hall, the employer, is the Florida Police Department. He was appointed then. He was separated then. He was. This is where he went after. He went to Robbins afterwards. So you can look up any officer in your town. You can look up any officer by agency, and you can find him here. And then I think we also had a where is it? Yeah, right here, like another cool little graph that shows like the percentage of officers there who came there after being fired from somewhere else. But I guess now, I mean, is this okay now to take questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, should I stop sharing then?
Yeah, yeah. Unless you have anything you wanted to show right now.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Casey. Yeah, that was really enlightening. So thank you for walking through that. So yeah, just a reminder to folks, if you do have questions, please make sure to type them in the chat feature there, the YouTube Live, and we will ask them here. Just one question was around the Form E database that you had talked about. I'm curious, like, when you had requested that and got it, was it pretty usable right away, or did you have to do a lot of work to actually get it into SQL and usable? And what was that process like?
Yeah, the data itself, like, thankfully was pretty clean. Something I did notice though, like one of the reasons like we clipped the data off of 2000 because if you collect, if you just use all the data going back to when they first started having it, like the older the data gets, the less reliable it gets in terms of like officers um being like it'll show an officer from like 1963 and it's just like him leaving his department was never like officially reported or just wasn't counted in the system. But like so the newer stuff, for the past, 20 something years has been pretty good. So that was the only thing really I had to do with it. I did have to like, I imported into, my SQL server and I did work on it with R and I wrote a pretty, in my opinion, at least for me, there's probably some SQL geniuses out here, but like I wrote a fairly complicated like subquery and a subquery and a subquery and a subquery to do it. And it works fast, but it took me a minute. But other than that, the data, like honestly, in the realm of government data that I've seen, like the Formy database is legit.
Cool. Yeah, yeah. So I was expecting to hear that was like just a bunch of PDFs that you had to like
Yeah.
scan
No.
and so that's good to hear. Yeah, and I guess just off of that, like the particular like is there a particular year that you kind of recommend as that cutoff, and is that tied to like a certain event or a certain regulation that kind of required certain things be
Uh,
reported more clearly?
I mean, maybe I could. I just did like 2000 because it's like, 24 years is a long time, right? Like it's enough to show like a pattern of stuff happening in a village. And it's long enough to keep up with the present. But it's like with anything, you really have to explore it. Like, so, as I mentioned, like this Robbins is at the top, Lorton is right below it. And Lorton, I was like, what is a Lorton? I've never heard of it before. And it turns out it used to be a town, like up until like a year ago or 2 years ago, when it got basically it was so poor and it was so broke that like three towns basically banded together and became one town. So Lorton doesn't exist anymore. So it's stuff like this that you really have to kind of poke and prod when you're looking at something. Especially if you're looking at trends. And so we note in the actual graphic that we display that Lorton is no longer a separate municipality. It merged with two other municipalities in 2021.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, another question from the audience here. Can you say a little more of how exactly you determined that the fired officer's next job was, particularly at Robbins or wherever? Like, how exactly did you determine that?
Yeah, it's like again, it's like in the SQL query, and I don't remember exactly what it is, but there is a function that you can use, and it's like basically I think like the first the first query I just like identified all cops who have been fired or something like that, and then like I basically rejoined it in back with all of their information, um, and then I did from there I determined like how many of them actually like had another job afterwards, right? And so then I like narrowed that down just to that select group of people. And then I rejoined it back with the history, right? And then I forget exactly what it was, but there's a SQL function that allows you that will create a column that shows the next like the following row like after like it'll create a new column that'll show the following row in one of your existing rows, right? And so if I ordered these police officers who had been fired, who had another job somewhere else, if I ordered their work history chronologically, I could use that to determine and to show where the next place is that they worked. So it's in its own separate column. So for Larry Hall, it shows Flossmoor, and then it determined that his next, like the row below it, like chronologically where he worked next was Robbins, and so then Robbins just kind of filled in that row. And again, as I mentioned in my speech, it was a thing where um, I essentially had to basically make the query so that this would only include employments that occurred, new employments after the person was fired, right? So if somebody worked at some job consistently for 20 years and they were fired from this one job, the job they had worked at before this job was not included in the query. It was only new employments after they were fired from somewhere.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that addresses kind of a follow-up question of if that would take into account if there was like a several year gap, between when they were fired and the new place, did were those people included as
Yeah, yeah.
part
Like
of
Larry Hall
training?
was like 3 or 4 years. This was a Larry Hall was 3 or 4 years. There are other people that were kind of the same thing. And it was kind of the same thing. And this was a like the data itself and my query, like I was like working on it for 3 or 4 days, just like poking and prodding to make sure that what I was looking at was the right thing. Because all the things I'm mentioning now, like, were problems that I identified while I was working on it. Um, yeah, it is a lead. It is a lead. Looking at the text, it is the lead SQL function. Um, so but this was a process of like trial and error, and then eventually I got it together, and I was really happy with it because it worked really well and it was fast, and it's not a huge database, but like it worked fast, and I felt like it worked fast and quickly. But even then, it's like it was interesting. Like I got an email from a cop who had been fired, or like he was reported as being fired by his boss. His boss didn't like him or whatever. But then like he showed me paperwork showing that the boss later like recanted that he was actually fired, and like human resources sent a letter to the training and standards board and they changed their information, so we removed him from ours.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you for explaining that process. Um, yeah, another question from the audience here. Any experience with graph databases? They're wondering if the exploration of the data would have been any easier using kind of a graph database.
Could you I guess I'm kind of unfamiliar with the concept.
To be honest, I am too. I am not familiar with databases. So, yeah, if there's an S that has any further information on a graph database is, I can pose that and we can come back to it.
Okay.
But yeah, I guess another question here, which is a question I had as well, which is if you know anything about kind of how this relates to broader nationwide averages. Are there percentages of previously fired cops or officers hired by poor towns and villages in Illinois that are similar to national averages, or how does it kind of compare to national
I,
averages?
So I couldn't like really bring up national averages, like the data by like state by state, is just kind of wildly different, but I did mention the story. I'm trying to find it. I talked to University of Chicago law professor John Rappaport. It was kind of interesting because John I'd actually known because he reached out earlier in his career, and he like cited one of my stories about suburban police shootings, and I was kind of going back to him now because he'd written about this. He'd written about this phenomenon of wandering officers in Florida, and he said that at least in the state of Florida, it was exactly like we kind of reported, where there's these like small little hamlets where they can't really pay anyone. So these officers that have these, often like wild work histories, like will go and work there. It's just kind of like a measure of last resort. So while I can't say what's happening nationwide, John basically said that like it's in line with, what he found in Florida. And it makes sense, like if you can only pay someone like less or about what you can get paid to like, flip fries at McDonald's, to do this like pretty serious job, all things considered, like, what are you going to get? And that's kind of what our story is about. And in Robbins, it's like they have no industry, they have no, commercial base. So it's like they don't have the tax revenue to afford like higher wages for anyone, right? Let alone police officers. And that's like what the heart of the problem is. Because in Illinois, property taxes are what fund, property taxes are what fund governments. And here it's like all residential, and the residential pool is shrinking.
Yeah, and on that note, yeah, kind of the wages and lack of tax revenue for it. A question related to that: what's the lowest hourly wage that you've seen for police officers in Illinois?
So in Robbins, it was like $10 an hour. They've since bumped it up because I think the cops there like got into a union and but they bumped it up basically to basically essentially what minimum wage is now. So it was like a few years ago it was $10. But they managed to bump it up. And something the mayor talks about is the mayor says that the largest raise in Robbins police history or something like that. But at this point it's like the largest raise in history is still way below what most people find acceptable. And it's like time and time again it was just like people with just crazy backgrounds. Like this one lady actually called me out of the blue because she was mad about something. And the more I looked into it, like she had like a couple of DUIs in her past, including a recent one. And like she was also getting sued because her like pit bull like bit a child in the face or something. I mean, it was just like everywhere I looked, it was just this kind of stuff, right? There's a person in command who got fired because he was drinking on the job, and then they brought him back because they couldn't fire him correctly. I mean, there's just all kinds of issues here. Because he said he was drinking off the job, but there's video of him in an office drinking, just to be clear.
Okay. Yeah, and another question kind of going back to that Form E database, just if you know a little more of the history of that Form E database, kind of when and why it was created. And perhaps more interestingly, do you know if other states have a similar one? And are you able to track officers that move out of state?
That's really interesting, and I honestly I don't know. Like it's not something that I looked at. And I do know I can't say why they do it. But like I feel like anything in like American life, like oftentimes the reason why things are done is because something horrible happened before, right? And but these in this case though, it is interesting, like the earliest recordings they have in it, like go back a ways, like go back, I think there might be some from the 60s and 50s in there. But at the time it was like paper. Like you can ask for like the paper records, and sometimes the paper records actually have more like they can be more current, right? But at some point they started transposing these paper records. Someone is doing it, transposing them from paper, digitally. Because on the form that they submit, like I don't know, I don't think they do it digitally. But it's been around a while. It's just I think like somewhat recently. Like I know that I've been using it for probably the past like 6 years.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I've gotten a little more information now from the chat and from Derek on going back to that graph database question. So apparently, yeah, the graph databases, it focuses more on kind of networks of relationships rather than kind of table structure with
Okay.
SQL. And yeah, just because of that kind of different architecture, it's apparently a little more flexible and better at kind of tracing relationships between nodes rather than kind of the more rigid table structure of SQL.
That's really interesting. I mean, I've never actually used that before. SQL is the one I'm like very familiar with, and I'm trying to like learn some more like with Python. I'm trying to learn Python right now, and that's been a challenge. But SQL is all I'm really familiar with. I mean, that sounds really cool. It's something like I'd like to like be aware of because I didn't really know such a thing existed. I just know that SQL like it just has a lot of utility. And it took me so long to figure out like how it worked and how to do kind of complicated things that it's just like my go-to. And even now it's like using it on the For Me thing, like, and I've only been using SQL now for I don't know 4 or 5 years, and it still feels like magic, you know. um, it still feels like magic, and it's fun because in journalism, I feel like you can create like have like little small factual items, and then just create like you can just create worlds of context like pretty quickly, and that's what we did here.
Mm. Yeah, and that's a great point because it segues, I think, very nicely into this other question that we had which is a little bit more about SQL and why you use it and if you'd recommend it. And yeah, you mentioned it a little bit, but can you say a little more of how kind of learning SQL has changed your reporting? It seems like you're kind of able to write stories now that you wouldn't maybe be able to otherwise. It's kind of related to that. Would you recommend, other reporters kind of take the time to learn SQL and use that, and any tips for them to kind of learn that?
Yeah, I mean, I would like I've kind of told people like if I could like develop a journalism curriculum, I would like just get rid of so much. And one of the things that I would make mandatory would be like a class in SQL. Because I feel like there's other like programming languages that might be easier that you can do a lot of stuff with faster. But with SQL, I feel like it gives you a really like core understanding of like how data works, right? And how data works with each other. And if you do it right, it also gives you like an understanding of like the logic of programming. And it just gives you like David Eads, who I've worked with before on stuff, he basically says it's like algebra, right? And I feel like just knowing it is it just allows me to create worlds quickly and extrapolate just a lot of information all at once. And it's like I can do things like, pull the CPD crime portal and I could, find something pretty quickly there. Like if I went to a job, and it's also like, you know, professionally, it's like if I go into a job interview, this is a thing that will make me a more attractive candidate against other people who are also very skilled, right? But they can't do this. And so I think there's something there too. But ultimately, I think it's cool. I think it's interesting. I think it makes my work more interesting. I think it makes it more accessible to people. And I learned it from a friend of Chai Hacknight, Forrest Gregg. I worked with him on a project called The Circuit where Forrest, I don't know if Derek was involved, but they basically scraped the Cook County Circuit Court database. Just drank the milkshake. Like it was pretty awesome. And then they compiled into this database that was like such a pain because it was just a manual entry over decades of like different clerks, like 300 different clerks, like writing stuff in. But it was like such a mess. But I kind of had to learn. I had to learn SQL for this in order to like make sense at all of this. Like there were like 50 tables, like 20 million records, whatever. Like I had to learn it to do this. And so I would recommend it to any reporter. I think like learning how data works, it's really kind of like changed the way I see the world. Like, and being able to code in SQL also, like it gave me a sense of like being able to like break things down to their smallest component and then building those together. And I think that's kind of cool. And it just made me a more confident person, I think, because I've been doing journalism for 20 years. And a lot of journalism, like I learn all the time while I'm doing stuff, but this is like it like stretches your brain in a different way, right? And I felt, hey, if I could learn how to do this, I could learn other things too. So I highly recommend anyone who's involved in journalism to do it. It'll put you ahead of your colleagues, and it'll make you a smarter, more informed citizen.
Great, thank you. Yeah, hopefully there's some aspiring journalists out there who are taking some notes on that. Um, all right, I think we have time for maybe one more question here. And that would be, what are some of the outcomes of the reporting on the story? You had mentioned the officer that had forged the signature. Commanding officer's signature was fired. Are there any other outcomes that you've seen because of this?
Well, that was the one. I mean, like, I have a kind of greater theory about power, right? And it's basically like my greater theory is that power is very pragmatic, right? And it just basically goes to like how willing people are to do something like this. And so I wrote about this guy, and I think honestly, in any other department, he'd probably been fired, but they don't have a lot there to deal with in terms of administration. And in our story, the kicker we used was basically that like he, after his like lawsuits against the Florida police department got thrown out, he serviced in the Robbins Police Department, where he quote performed his duties over the past 10 years in a spirit of excellence and with compassion for the Village of Robbins residents, according to a village spokesman, right? And so they were like, we can't fire him because he's been great for the past 10 years. Other officers I've talked to said that's not the case, but that's what the village says, and that's what they're sticking to it. But notably, who we didn't quote in the story, the current chief, who was like, yeah, I've known him. He's been great. He's great. The chief recently got fired for allegedly like beating up an influencer in the police department lobby, right? So things are always kind of on the change. Things are always changing there. And now, I don't know if this is dispiriting Hall, the main officer I wrote about who, had sex with the person in the squad car and then lied about it. He's probably the highest ranking commander in the Robbins Police Department. So sometimes the things that you think might happen don't happen, but at the end of the day, I feel like it's important for stuff like this to get out there, right? Because otherwise I feel like it's just the lie just kind of goes on and no one knows about it and there's no accountability. But here there's at least something that people will know.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely appreciate you reporting on it. As you said, it's definitely good to just have it out there so people are aware of it. So thank you for reporting on it and doing the work. And yeah, thank you so much for presenting this evening as well. It's really insightful.